welcome to this Histopod revision of the reigns of King Richard and King John. First, a quick overview. The reigns of King Richard and King John has three sections to it. It has life and government in England, involvement overseas, and King John's downfall. We will be focusing today on life and government in England, and we will be looking at the feudal system and kingship, the first two parts of that. And this is Richard and John, Histopod 1. Firstly, a little bit of overview here. Our story of Richard and John takes place in three different venues. The first venue is in medieval England. You can see the map there. Our second venue is in France, and the areas in red are the Angevin Empire. This part of France was controlled by English kings. The French kings wanted these lands, and there was often conflict. Richard was successful in keeping these lands. John lost them. Our third venue is the Middle East, and this is, of course, the Crusades. Richard led the Third Crusade to try to take back Jerusalem from the Muslim armies under Saladin. And that is the venue you can see, the Middle East, the venue of the Third Crusade, and you can see Jerusalem down there with the arrow. So today we are looking at the feudal system as part 1 and kingship and succession as part 2. Firstly, looking at the feudal system, we will divide this again into three parts. The first part is the feudal structure. The second part is about services, knight service and labour service in that middle column. And the third column will be about the church. The third part of this will be about the church. Looking first at the feudal system. As you can see, you have got service goes up the system and land goes down. So the king grants land to the nobles, then land is granted to the knights, and then to peasants. And they all give services on the way up. They give services to the people above them. Peasants give food and services. The knights give protection and military service to the nobles and the king. And the nobles organize knights and give money and advice to the king. There you have the feudal hierarchy, king at the top. Then we have the nobles, or the tenants in chief as we call them, or the barons. Then you have the knights. Then you have the peasants. Let's have a look at who is in the feudal system. Let's have a look at who is in the feudal system. The feudal system was introduced into England after William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings in 1066. There were four main ranks in the feudal system: the king, the tenants-in-chief, the knights, and the peasants. The king. The king was at the top of the feudal hierarchy. He was the most powerful person in the country, and all the land belonged to him. He demanded the obedience of his people. In return, the king had a responsibility to protect his people. To do this, he needed an army. But this was expensive, as soldiers needed paying and providing with horses and weapons. So the feudal system was used to enable the king to recruit soldiers without paying for them. The tenants-in-chief. The king divided up his land, the land in his kingdom, and granted some of it to tenants-in-chief. They held their land in return for providing services to the king. The most important service was to provide knights for the king's army. They also provided advice to the king and helped to manage the kingdom. Important tenants-in-chief were called barons, while others were high-ranking members of the church, such as archbishops and bishops. The knights. The knights, or under-tenants, held land from the tenants-in-chief, and in return they fought on horseback in the king's army when the king demanded knights from his tenants-in-chief. This meant that the knights provided their fighting skills and provided their own horses and weapons in return for their lands. The knights were usually lords of manorial estates. The peasants. At the bottom of the feudal system, there was a very large class, most of whom were peasants, who held little power. They worked the land for the knights and the tenants-in-chief. In return, the army of knights, recruited by the tenants-in-chief, would protect them from invasion. Land holding and homage. The king could not control his lands alone. His land was divided into fiefs. A fief was a portion of land that was granted to a landholder. In return, the landholder had to pledge homage to his lord by swearing an oath of fealty or loyalty. When he swore this oath, he became the vassal of his lord and was required to perform service for him in return for the land that they held. The vassal made his oath in a public ceremony. It was treason to break the oath, and the oath breaker could be punished by death. The king kept some lands for himself, and that became known as the royal domain or royal lands. The remaining lands were divided up amongst his tenants-in-chief, most of whom were barons. The fiefs that they held were scattered across England. These barons kept some land for their own needs and subdivided the rest of their lands to the knights, who became their vassals or under-tenants. The knights also divided out their land amongst the peasants who lived on it. The peasants held strips of land and farmed it in return for protection provided to them by the knights. Now you have different kinds of service. Knight service. Knight service was the duty that knights owed to their lord in return for holding their land. The tenants-in-chief granted lands, known as a knight's fee, to knights, and in return, the knights performed certain duties. To serve in the king's army for at least 2 months at his own expense, and that included providing his own horse, weapons, and armour. If a conflict lasted for longer, then he had to be kept on at the king's expense. To perform up to 40 days' service in guarding the lord's castle and training. To help raise money to pay the ransom of his lord if he was captured in battle and imprisoned. The quota of knights that tenants-in-chief owed to the king depended on how much land they held from him. The quota was known as the servitium debitum, and the number of knights owed by the tenants-in-chief ranged from a handful to some 50 or 60 knights. Across the whole of England, there were up to 5,000 men who owed knight service in return for their land. In the ceremony of knighthood, the knights were presented with a sword and belt and struck gently on the back of the neck with their sword. This was known as dubbing. The new knight also placed his sword on the altar in a church and promised his services to his overlord and to God. In return for his oath, the knight received land that he could rent out to those below him in the feudal system. The rents provided knights with enough money to support themselves and their family, but they were not necessarily rich. Labour service. This was carried out by the peasants, the villeins. The lowest rank of society came below the knights. These included freemen, villeins, and cotters. Collectively, these people were usually referred to as peasants, and the majority of peasants were villeins. The peasants produced all the food for the country's population to eat. In return for their land, villeins and cotters had a feudal duty to perform labour service for the knights and tenants-in-chief. The villeins had to work for the lord on his land on certain days of the week. This work was known as week work. In addition, the villeins had to work for the lord gathering in the harvest. This was known as boon work. The cotters worked for 1 day a week on their lord's land. Freemen did not have to work on the lord's land. They paid a rent instead. Peasants did not owe military service. It was the duty of their overlord to protect them. One other feature we have to look at is forfeiture. Forfeiture helped the feudal system to function properly. If a vassal did not perform his service as he'd sworn to do on oath, the lord could take their land away. This was known as forfeiture. For example, if a knight did not turn up to fight when he was summoned to perform his knight service, his land was forfeit to their lord. The lord could then grant the land to a faithful vassal. The next thing we have to look at is the hierarchy of the church. The church was really important. As you can see, the Pope in Rome and the cardinals are the most important in the church as a whole in Europe. But in England, you have the archbishops with the Archbishop of Canterbury at the top, the bishops, and then the parish priests and the monks and the nuns. The role and influence of the church. In the medieval world, religion was at the centre of most people's lives. The purpose of life was to earn a place in heaven, and every major stage of life was influenced by religion. People were expected to attend religious services frequently and to celebrate the many feast days in the church calendar. People had to participate in these services and feasts if they were to go to heaven when they died. The majority of people in Western Europe were Catholic Christians, and the Catholic Church was controlled by the Pope, who was based in Rome. The Pope was regarded as God's representative on earth, which meant that all Catholics, even kings, were subject to his authority. Kings did have some control over the church in their own country, and they expected to have a say in the appointment of key church officials, especially archbishops and bishops. However, this issue sometimes led to conflict with the Pope. The church was very wealthy. Many people donated money or land to the church, often in their wills. They would do this so that members of the church would pray for them after they died, which would help them get to heaven. The church earned rents from its land and profits from the agricultural work done on it. By the 13th century, wool earned the church a lot of money. Looking at the structure of the church, the most important churchman in England was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He supervised all of England's clergy. He was supported by the Archbishop of York, who supervised the church in the north of England, and some other bishops ranked below him. The bishops managed an area called a diocese. They were responsible for the priests and monks in their diocese. The clergy's main role was to care for the spiritual welfare of the people by making sure they correctly followed the teachings of the church, but they were also an important part of the feudal system. The archbishops and bishops held land as vassals of the king, and the church owned about 20% of the land in England. This land could not be taken away from the church, but churchmen were expected to perform duties for it. Their first duty was to perform church services. They carried out baptisms, marriages, and burials, as well as daily services. In addition, important churchmen such as archbishops, bishops, and abbots had to supply a quota of knights for the king's army. Many churchmen were educated and could read and write. This meant they often became clerks, record keepers, also known as clerics, in baronial and royal households. Some important churchmen became members of the government. For example, the king's chancellor was always a cleric. In this way, the church had an influence on the king's decisions. The king relied upon clerics for the day-to-day government of the kingdom, so it was important for him to remain on good terms with the church. The next part, the second half of this, is on the nature of kingship. And we look at what kingship means, its nature, Richard becoming king, and John becoming king. Those are the three parts here. Looking at the nature of kingship, you can see four sections there. The right of succession, what rights you have to make you king. The rights of kingship, duties, and rituals and displays. Firstly, The nature of kingship. The medieval monarch was a powerful ruler with complete responsibility for governing his kingdom. This meant that the character and abilities of the king were of great importance. The king needed to be a strong ruler to control his kingdom, to enforce justice, and to keep the kingdom safe from attack. The whole nation depended on him to do this effectively. Now to the top right box, the rights of succession. Top left box, sorry, the right of succession. In the 11th century, the Normans introduced the principle of primogeniture. According to this principle, the eldest son inherits his father's title and all his lands. In the case of a king, it meant that the eldest legitimate son would inherit the throne. A child was legitimate if they were born to the queen while she was married to the king. However, by the late 12th century, this principle had not been fully established for the succession of kings. In fact, Richard I was the first English king for more than 100 years to inherit the throne from his father. In that time, kings had been nominated by the previous king or had been chosen by leading barons in the kingdom. The succession was important because if it was unclear who would be the next monarch, then there could be civil war. Rights of kingship. In the top right box, from the moment a king was anointed with holy oils at his coronation, the ceremony where a monarch is crowned, he took the title of Rex or king and was given divine authority. This meant that he was chosen by God to be king and his subjects could not question his authority. It was not until the reign of King John and the issuing of the Magna Carta that subjects attempted to place some controls on the king. Now, the king had duties in the bottom left-hand box. The king was the greatest authority in the kingdom. He was the decision maker, and both foreign and domestic policy were decided by him. However, a king could not do exactly as he pleased. During the coronation, the king had to make an oath where he promised to perform certain duties. In the oath, the king promised to keep the peace. He also promised to protect his people by punishing excessive greed of feudal lords and to maintain justice. The king was the supreme lawmaker, and he had a duty to show fairness and mercy in his judgments. In order to fulfill his oath, the king or his agents needed to travel around the country, hearing cases and making judgments. This itinerant kingship helped the king to build relationships with his most important nobles by meeting with them and staying in their castles. One of the king's most important duties was to protect his kingdom and its people from foreign attack and civil wars. He needed to be able to plan campaigns, direct his armies, and to choose capable military leaders. The king often led the army himself as a warrior. Richard I is one of the greatest examples of a warrior king. There were also important rituals and display, and this is in the bottom right-hand corner. A medieval king needed to be seen by his subjects to reinforce his authority. Formal occasions and rituals were arranged to enable the king to do this. The greatest ritual was the coronation, where the king was anointed with holy oils and crowned in front of the most important nobles and clerics. However, the more regular displays of the king's majesty were also needed. This system of itinerant kingship helped with this. The king was seen by his subjects when he held courts across the country. Since the reign of William the Conqueror, kings had taken place in the ritual of crown wearings. When he was present in England, the king wore his crown in 3 different places at 3 important times in the year: in Winchester at Easter, in Gloucester at Christmas, in Westminster at Whitsun. The crown wearings were important occasions, and they were accompanied by pageants and feasts. Rituals and public displays of kingship like crown wearings, encouraged loyalty to the monarch and reminded the people of his power and authority. Just a key term to go over again there: itinerant kingship, the practice of the king and his court travelling from place to place around the country. We now look at Richard as king. Introduction first. Richard was known as Coeur de Lion, or Lionheart, is perhaps the most famous English medieval king. He was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard developed a reputation as an outstanding warrior and king while he was alive, and his reputation has been enhanced in myth and legend ever since. Now looking at Richard's claim to the throne. In 1189, when Henry II died, Richard was his eldest surviving legitimate son. While the principle of primogeniture, as mentioned earlier, had not yet been established as the sole reason for the succession of a king, Richard had an excellent claim to the throne. Richard was the favourite son of his mother, Eleanor, and he had been made Duke of Aquitaine in 1172. Aquitaine was a vast territory in southern France and brought Richard both wealth and power. By contrast, his younger brother John, who was the favourite of his father, possessed no lands at all at the time of Henry's death. Although Richard had a good claim to the throne, he feared that Henry intended to make John the King of England after his death. This fear led him to fight alongside the French king, Philip II, against his father and in 1187 to 89 and capture land in the Angevin Empire. Key term: the Angevin Empire, the lands that Henry II and his family held in England, Wales and France. The empire stretched from Northumbria in England to the Pyrenees on the border with Spain. The name Angevin comes from Anjou, the county Henry inherited from his father. So that's Richard's claim to the throne. Once you've become king and you've got that claim, you've then got to secure power. You've got to secure power. And this is Richard securing power. This is what he did. Richard may have betrayed his father, but there was no other realistic successor to the throne in 1189. Even his brother John had realized that he had no chance of claiming the throne while Richard lived. He had joined Richard in his rebellion, and in the last months before Henry's death, no doubt John realized that it was important to win the favor of the soon-to-be king. Richard had a glorious coronation on the 3rd of September 1189. He appeared dressed in gold from head to toe, and he took the coronation oath, swearing to protect his kingdom. The occasion was marked by feasting and pageants, although it was spoiled by an attack on London's Jewish community. After his coronation, Richard's greatest desire was to go on crusade. To do this, he needed to secure his kingdom. He made peace against the men who had fought with his father against him. He appointed William Longchamp as his chancellor to manage the kingdom in his absence. He appointed his half-brother Geoffrey, who could be a rival because he was a family member, as Archbishop of York. Richard had feared that Geoffrey might seize the throne, so he made him archbishop because a cleric could not become king. To appease his brother John, dealing with family again here, who could have a claim to the throne, and discourage him from claiming the throne in his absence, Richard made him Count of Mortain in Normandy and granted him lands in England. Land is what John had always wanted. However, he did not give John control of any castles that could be used as a base for rebellion. Having dealt with his family, Geoffrey and John, and given them something of what he wanted, he banned Geoffrey and John from England for 3 years to prevent rebellion. By taking these measures, Richard had secured his power. Now, the third part of Richard's claim to the throne and securing power, the third thing we have to look at is Richard's character there at the bottom of the slide. Richard is often regarded as the model of a medieval king. At the time, he was seen as a great warrior who did his Christian duty by leading a crusade to the Holy Land. His personality, his success in battle, and his charisma helped him gain the loyalty of his subjects. Richard's character was formed in Aquitaine, where he spent much of his teenage years. As a young man, Richard was deeply influenced by the code of chivalry, which guided his training as a knight and his behaviour in battle. On the other hand, in spite of his love of chivalry, he also had a practical view of warfare. He believed that problems could be solved by battle, and he admired ruthlessness. Richard also had less attractive qualities. His time in Aquitaine had made him arrogant and selfish, and on 3 occasions he'd broken his feudal oath and rebelled against his father. Away from the battlefield, chivalry continued to play an important part in his behaviour. He developed chivalric ideas of courtly love, which is an idealised form of love where men almost worship women in poetry and song. Richard's enthusiasm for courtly love influenced the poetry and music that he wrote. So Richard had the right kind of character for a medieval king. Great warrior, brave, chivalrous, although he was disloyal to his father, selfish and arrogant. Now, the last thing we have to do, the last part of this section, is to look at John and his claim to the throne, and then we're done. John as king. If Richard is often regarded as the greatest medieval king, then John is usually portrayed as the worst. This image of a villainous king has been preserved in the tales of Robin Hood, and it's not entirely wrong. John did seize control of England during Richard's absence on the crusade, and he imposed heavy taxes during his reign. However, John's image has developed through myth and legend. Now, John's claim to the throne. Let's look at this quickly in a little bit more detail. John was the 5th and last son of Henry and Eleanor. By the time he reached his teenage years, his parents' land was already divided between his older brothers, and so John became known as Lackland. Henry's plan for John to become Lord of Ireland fell through. When on expedition in 1185, John insulted the Irish princes by pulling their beards. John was his father's favourite, and it was, it seemed, being trained for kingship by him. However, John was no match for Richard as a soldier, and because of this, there is little chance he could become king while Richard was alive. Richard's succession had been very straightforward. He was the oldest legitimate son of his father and the popular choice of the Angevin barons. John's claim, when his time came, was much more complicated. He had the following factors in his favour, and of course, John came to the throne in 1199 after the death of Richard. His claim was supported by Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, William Marshal, one of the greatest knights of his era and an important baron, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the preferred candidate for the English and Norman barons. He was 31 years old, in the prime of life, and had proven himself as a warrior by fighting against the French king with Richard. He had demonstrated that he possessed some of the qualities that were required by a king. However, he was not the only claimant to the throne. His elder brother, Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, had a son, Arthur. On the principle of primogeniture, Arthur had a better claim to the throne than John. The barons in Brittany and some in Anjou preferred Arthur's claim, and Arthur was supported by the King of France. Now, what did John do to secure power? Look at the bottom part here, securing power. Fortunately for John, his claim to the throne was accepted after Richard's death. Arthur was only 12 at the time and was regarded as a foreigner by the English. With the support of Eleanor, the English barons were encouraged to accept John. He was crowned king on the 27th of May, 1199, and took the oath to protect the church, abolish bad laws, and do justice to his people. John then showed his religious devotion by visiting the shrines at Canterbury and Bury St Edmunds. Demonstrating good judgment, John appointed a loyal baron to protect the north of his kingdom from the threat of Scotland. Just 4 weeks later, John left for France to secure the continental lands of the Angevin Empire. He left the government of England in the hands of trusted men who had served Richard loyally. In May 1200, John met with the French King Philip and they agreed a peace treaty. John agreed to give some Angevin lands to Philip. John agreed to do homage to Philip for his continental lands and pay £13,500. Philip dropped his support for Arthur's claim. Paying homage to the French king was a move that John took to secure power and to make peace that his father and brother Richard had never done. They'd never paid homage. The French king was technically overlord of lands in France, and technically, therefore, the King of England was his vassal. So, in effect, John has made himself, in exchange for peace, technically the vassal of Philip. However, the peace did not last very long, and this complicated John's ability to secure the throne. He made enemies. One of the ways he made enemies was the murder of Arthur. The peace did not last long. By 1200, Philip and John were back at war with one another, and once again, Arthur joined Philip. John was furious. He'd made Arthur do homage to him for Brittany, and Arthur had broken his feudal oath by siding with Philip. In August 1202, Arthur was captured after a battle at Mirabeau. The events that followed severely damaged John's reputation. Arthur was kept imprisoned in chains while John decided what to do with him. According to the chivalric code, John should have ransomed him, or alternatively tried him, put him on court in trial as a traitor. However, John did neither. Contemporary accounts tell us that John ordered that Arthur should be castrated and blinded. However, Arthur's jailers refused to do this. Sometime after this, either John or someone else stabbed Arthur to death and dumped his body in the River Seine. Even John's supporters were horrified by his treatment of his nephew, and many trusted barons began to change sides to support Philip. The point is that we're talking about how John secured the throne. Murdering Arthur made the throne less secure for him because it made him enemies. Now, our final bit, John's character in becoming king. In 1199, John was regarded by the English barons as the best candidate for the throne. And John had learnt from his father many of the qualities needed to be a good king. John had also spent some time in his youth in England and developed an understanding of its system of government. In his time in England meant that he was regarded as English, and at first this helped him to encourage loyalty from his barons. John's reign began well when he selected capable men to manage England while he was absent in France. This shows intelligence and good judgment. John had also proven himself to be a capable military leader while supporting Richard's wars against the French. This experience was highly valued in an era when the king played a role in warfare. However, there were flaws in his character and behaviour that were revealed early on in his reign. His short temper, cruelty, and rash behaviour was demonstrated by his decision to murder Prince Arthur. John did not trust many people, and his suspicious nature meant that subjects had little loyalty to him. So, in summary, very quickly, we have looked at the nature of kingship today. Secondly, and firstly, we have looked at the feudal system. You need to use this to revise and to do your revision homework. Remember, you can stop and start this in any place that you like.